We'll take some time this morning going over this work and kind of walking everybody through it so we have a good sense of just what's in the book and what's different about the process and how it's put together. Okay? First off, it's really important that we understand that when St. Louis de Montfort was writing about consecration, and he writes about consecration in a number of his prose works, not just in his famous work, True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. He speaks about consecration in a variety of ways, and he talks about how one comes to this point of giving oneself to our Lord through Our Lady in a variety of ways, but drawing from a common core, and that common core is this. Christian life, understood by Father de Montfort, is nothing less than a radical sharing and participating in the life of Jesus Christ. And Father de Montfort is not interested in anything devotionally that is not at the service of deepening this full participation in the life of Jesus Christ. And so for him, consecration is not a prayer to be said, it's a way of life to be lived. One can, in all justice, describe his spirituality then as a spirituality of consecration. That is a spirituality of self-surrender and self-gift, into the mighty hands of that same Lord who has so completely given himself to us. And devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary is situated by Father de Montfort then at the very heart, the very center, the very core of this mutual self-giving of our Lord to us and for us, and of ourselves to our Lord. That is why Father de Montfort, when he speaks about then making an act of consecration to Our Lady, speaks about it as something for which we must be ready, for which we must be prepared. If saying or making an act of total consecration was simply a matter of having the right formula in front of us and kneeling down and saying it, there wouldn't be the need to be ready. But if it really is the first and a decisive step on a spiritual journey, a series of spiritual movements, then before one can take such a step, one must be well prepared. In his book, Secret of Mary, Father de Montfort, writing to a particular individual, seems to indicate that for him, for this person, simply working through and understanding what he's written in that book is a sufficient preparation. In his book, Love of Eternal Wisdom, Father de Montfort leaves us the text of an act of consecration, the act that's familiar to many of us, without outlining what the preparatory steps to say that act would be. In his book, True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin, Father de Montfort sketches a possible process of preparation of 33 days. This is the process that most of us are familiar with. But as we can see just by looking at Father de Montfort's own writings, it's not the only way he understands this. And that's important, because when we talk about this, one of the first things we want to lay aside is a sense of scrupulosity. That if I don't do it exactly this way, suddenly I'm doing it wrong. Or that Father de Montfort wrote one system to which we must adhere, because he didn't. In fact, in the True Devotion itself, while Father de Montfort speaks of a 33-day process, what he doesn't do, and to our knowledge, what he never did, was actually put together a 33-day series of reflections from day 1 to day 33 with, this is exactly what I want you to read on these days, okay? He outlined it. And the various ways of making an act of total consecration that have come down to us since then are the products of his descendants spiritually, the Montfort missionaries, as they've tried to understand what Father de Montfort was getting after with regard to consecration, and how best to articulate that in a way that would be effective and accessible to the people that they were working with. And now we're going to pause for a moment. True devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary was written in the year 1712, to the best of our knowledge. That means that right now we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of the composition of True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it is with great delight that we're able to begin making available this renewed and revised preparation for consecration as part of our celebration of this great anniversary. But it's important as well that we understand, even though True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin was written in 1712, it wasn't immediately disseminated and published at that point. In fact, when Father de Montfort died in the year 1716, just 4 years later, shortly thereafter, his work seems to have been lost. We know, in fact, that not long after, his work was lost. And it was as if it simply disappeared from all consciousness and all memory. And no one was aware of this marvelous work, including his spiritual children, the Montfort missionaries themselves. In 1842, think about that a minute. Father de Montfort died in 1716. It wasn't until 1842 that true devotion to the Blessed Virgin was, in a sense, rediscovered. And in the wake of that rediscovery, there was a renewed amount of preaching on the part of the Montfortians on our Blessed Virgin. They published the work, and rapidly it began disseminating itself. And from that point on, one of the curious things is true devotion to the Blessed Virgin has run ahead of us to wherever we were going to be. Whenever the Montfort missionaries have moved to a new location, that little book has been waiting for them. And so it came to the United States before we did. It came to Canada before we did. It's come to parts of Africa that we haven't been to yet. It's been translated into nearly every language on the globe. Downstairs in my offices, I have copies of the True Devotion in Arabic and Japanese. And this work has exercised a curious and compelling power over many of the Christian faithful through the years. A number of religious will talk about how, when they were in their novitiate formation, they worked through true devotion or made an act of consecration according to St. Louis de Montfort. Priests around the world will talk about their familiarity with it, and obviously great numbers of lay faithful have found either the true devotion or consecration manual placed in their hands over the years. And this has been spiritually generative of a number of really great vocations in the service of the Church. The influence of St. Louis de Montfort and his true devotion on Blessed John Paul II and Mother Teresa is something that's widely known. But its inspiration in the founding of the Legion of Mary is also one of the most compelling fruits of this spiritual way. And so around the world, in various areas, in ways really dramatic and in ways much more humble and simple, but equally deep, this spirituality and this way of consecration have begun asserting themselves. When the Montfortians began preaching the true devotion, or as it was called in the time, the devotion of holy slavery, with that word being understood as radical and total belonging to Jesus Christ. One of the things that was necessary was putting together a way that would fill in the details of the skeleton that Father de Montfort left in true devotion, because people had questions. I'd like to do this over 33 days, but could you help me? And what would it look like to really try and systematically go through a process? And so what the first priests began doing was They recognize that there are four principal movements that Father de Montfort articulates. And he recommends that certain prayers be said and that there be certain themes to the meditation. And so they began compiling resources that will be helpful for people. This is the origin, for example, of the familiar references to the imitation of Christ. Nowhere in Father de Montfort does he recommend, these specific readings from the imitation of Christ. And one would say, well, why were they chosen? For this reason. At the time, it was probably the most widely read and distributed work on the spiritual life. An educated layperson who had a spiritual library would have that on his bookshelf. What the same educated layperson would not have on his or her bookshelf would be the collected works of St. Louis de Montfort. And so the decision is made, let's go with something that people know, that people have on their bookshelf, and that has a relation to the spirituality, has a very common thread of thought. And so that was done. The same way certain excerpts from True Devotion were recommended, because the assumption would be, if you're interested in this at all, it's because you've run into a copy of True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the first French manuals were put together in that very particular and very practical way. But oftentimes with full introductions to each of the passages to orient the reader. As many of those were brought over into English, and again, keep in mind the practicality of being a missionary in a new territory who's busy preaching and needs a tool to use for formation. The first and the easiest thing to translate are the references to texts. And it's easy to say imitation of Christ, page number or chapter number. It's a lot more difficult to translate a theoretical or an explanatory introduction. And so one of the things that we saw as some of these works were brought over into other parts of the world was some of the fullness of the French originals didn't come with them. And that's in part due to the linguistic abilities of the missionaries who are doing the translating, and the practical needs that they have of, I need something to give to the people now. And so what they did was they put together serviceable consecration manuals that could be easily read, easily mastered, quickly printed, and widely distributed. This is the origin of the little orange book, the little brown book, the process of consecration that's often found in the back of an old edition of True Devotion to Mary, that many of us are familiar with. And these editions have really done a great service to the church because they've taken this rich spirituality and placed it in the hands of very many. However, as you can see from that explanation and from the history of development, it hasn't always been as full and ample a resource as it could be. And this is one of the reasons for our desire to produce the new work. And one of the first things that we've done in compiling this work was to go back across the history, and I have over 100 years of consecration manuals and editions of True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin downstairs on my bookshelves. And it's a lot of French to work through. But it's also been very, very instructive to see over the years what the spiritual wisdom of those who have allowed themselves to be steeped by this devotion has had to show us and teach us and manifest to us in terms of understanding and living the process of consecration. The other thing is, one of the advantages we have today that we did not have in the English-speaking world, say, 50 years ago, is a solid and reliable collection in a single volume of the prose writings of St. Louis de Montfort. It's easily accessible, it's readily accessible, it's available. And if we're going to understand the process of consecration as an introduction into a fuller and richer spirituality, it became important to say, let's begin including some references from the writings of Father de Montfort himself so that the communication of his Spirit is done directly and not indirectly. So one of the changes that will greet the reader as he or she opens this book is that we won't see readings from Thomas à Kempis and the Imitation of Christ. This is not because we think they're bad. It's because we believe it's better and more effective to allow Father de Montfort to more directly communicate the wealth of his spirituality to us. And since those texts are accessible now in translation, that seems a very, very good way to go.